Live television wasn't ready for what happened next. A state assembly member, Zohran Mamdani, with nothing to lose, brought out a hidden investigation, and Stephen M. Ross couldn't hide behind his polished reputation this time. It was supposed to be just another segment on NY1's weekly political roundtable. 4 guests, 1 moderator, and a New York City audience expecting more of the same. People tuning in from apartments across the 5 boroughs had no idea they were about to witness one of the most jaw-dropping moments in recent memory. The set was standard: dark blue backlit panels, high chairs, and coffee mugs nobody actually drank from. Seated third from the left, Assemblymember Zohran Mamdani looked focused, almost coiled, in a simple dark suit. His expression didn't change much throughout the first 20 minutes. He listened, made notes, said little. But when the host pivoted the conversation toward ethics and urban development, something shifted. The camera cut to Stephen M. Ross, seated across from Zohran. In an impeccable suit, radiating the unshakable confidence of a billionaire, he was doing what he'd done countless times before, sidestepping tough questions with the practiced ease of a man who hosts charity galas and closes billion-dollar deals. The audience didn't blink. They'd seen this routine. But Zohran leaned forward, not too far, just enough to send a silent message. "I'm ready." "Well, Zohran," said, his voice smooth but firm, "since we're talking about ethics, let's stop pretending some people get a free pass just because of the skyscrapers they build." The panel went quiet. The host blinked. Stephen Ross tilted his head slightly. "I'm sorry, was that directed at me?" Zohran didn't flinch. He reached into his bag, not frantically, not dramatically, and pulled out a neatly stacked folder. He placed it on the table, slid off the clip, and began laying out photocopied records one after another. "These are eviction notices, city zoning variances, and a report from a stalled investigation by the State Attorney General's office," Zohran said calmly, "all tied to a network of shell LLCs used in the last decade, and every single one leads directly back to your company." You could hear a pin drop. Ross's eyes flicked down at the documents. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the host. "That's absurd," he finally said with a tight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "This is clearly a politically motivated attack. I won't engage in socialist conspiracy theories." "It's not a theory if it's backed by public records and tenant affidavits," Zohran replied. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Behind the cameras, producers were scrambling. Someone in the control booth was signaling frantically. An assistant handed a note to the host, but the damage was already done. Clips of the exchange were being recorded and shared live by viewers on social media. Within minutes, hashtags like #Mamdani vs Ross and #Zohran has receipts began trending. Ross tried to pivot. "We're here to talk about New York's future, not dig up baseless attacks on the people creating jobs." Zohran interrupted gently. "With all due respect, when your business model raises questions about tenant displacement and exploiting tax loopholes, it is New York's future." The moderator, finally regaining his voice, tried to steer the conversation away. "Let's stay on topic, please." "I am on topic," Zohran said, not looking away. "The topic is accountability." People watching at home were glued to their screens. No one had ever confronted a titan like Ross like that, especially not on live local television. Not with facts, not with documentation, not with the kind of confidence that says, "I know what I'm doing and I know what I'm risking." And just like that, the story slipped out of the studio's control. But before Zohran ever touched that folder, he'd already made peace with what might come next. 3 days before the roundtable, Zohran sat across from his legislative director in a quiet corner booth at a diner in Astoria, Queens, the kind of place with the clatter of plates and the constant smell of coffee. Zohran wasn't hungry. He had a folder in front of him, not the same one he'd carry on television, but close. "This isn't just political," his aide, Liam Connolly, said as he leaned in, his voice low. "You're talking about Stephen M. Ross. He doesn't just own half of Manhattan. He owns politicians in Albany. They're gonna come after you. Hard." Zohran stirred his coffee but didn't drink it. "Let them," he said quietly. "People need to stop pretending he's just a philanthropist building a city. He's a landlord with paperwork, Liam. There's proof. Liam sighed and glanced toward the window. Proof doesn't always win. Sometimes it just gets you buried. Zohran didn't answer right away. He had spent most of his adult life walking into rooms where he wasn't expected to organize, let alone legislate. A community organizer from Queens, the son of immigrants with no family money, no legacy name, just grit and receipts. He'd fought his way into the state assembly on the backs of grassroots supporters who believed in his fire. Not everyone in Albany respected him, but they feared how sharp he was when he spoke. "I'm not trying to start a fire," he finally said. "I'm trying to show people it's already burning." Back at his apartment that night, he went through every page again. Reports from a stalled fraud case in the AG's office that no one ever followed up on. Signatures on zoning applications from city officials who later took jobs at development firms. Then there were the financial documents. Property deeds transferred between a dozen shell LLCs registered in Delaware, all dated just before major rezoning decisions were announced. He didn't have the whole picture, but he had enough corners to make out what had once been hidden. Still, there was a weight to it, not just the threat of lawsuits or political blowback from the real estate lobby. This was a personal gamble. He wasn't just going after a powerful billionaire. He was taking on the machinery that had kept men like him protected for decades. His phone buzzed, a message from a friend at the city, an independent news outlet. "Are you seriously going through with this? They'll twist it. They'll say you're an angry, anti-business radical." Zohran stared at the screen for a moment before replying. "They always say that, until they can't." The next morning, he reached out to a retired paralegal named Maria Flores, who'd quietly shared the AG's case files with him years earlier. Maria was in her late 70s now, mostly off the grid, but still sharp. "You sure you're ready to go public?" Maria asked, her voice calm and raspy through the speakerphone. "They've buried too much," Zohran said. "You and I both know this man's record didn't just disappear, it was erased on purpose." Maria paused, then with a dry laugh said, "You've got bigger balls than half the people I worked with at the Attorney General's office." Zohran smiled, but the weight never really left his chest. Courage always came with a clock ticking somewhere in the distance. By the time he walked into the studio on the day of the show, the folder felt heavier than it should have. Not physically, but emotionally. He knew he wouldn't get a second shot at this. Either he said it clearly the first time, or the moment would slip through the cracks of manufactured outrage and PR spin. But what no one saw behind the cameras was the conversation he had with himself in the hallway mirror 10 minutes before airtime. Be precise. Be steady. Don't yell. Let the facts do the shouting. Then he whispered the same 3 words he always said before walking into something that scared him. Tell the truth. He walked past the stage manager, past the flashing red countdown light, past the fake smiles from guests who thought today was just going to be business as usual. And when he sat down and looked across the table at Stephen M. Ross, he didn't see a titan of industry. He saw someone protected by silence. And Zohran had already decided he wasn't going to be part of that silence anymore. But to understand what Zohran knew, we have to go back even further. Into the details Stephen Ross had spent years trying to keep buried. Long before he was a household name synonymous with the Manhattan skyline, Stephen Ross was just another ambitious developer from Detroit trying to make his mark in New York's outer boroughs. According to the glossy magazine profiles and rehearsed interviews, his rise was a classic American success story, a visionary who built a real estate empire from scratch. But Zohran Mamdani wasn't interested in success stories. He wanted to know what had been left out. One of his interns, a sharp 24-year-old named Ben Carter, had been the first to flag inconsistencies in the early records of Ross's company. They had been combing through archived NYC property deeds in business registries from the 1980s and found a pattern of shell companies tied to Ross's first developments. "He registers a new LLC for almost every building he buys in Queens," Ben told Zohran one afternoon as they sat in a cramped legislative office in Albany. "The problem is, campaign finance records show donations from the heads of those same LLCs to a specific city councilman just weeks before Ross's projects got crucial zoning variances." Zohran leaned over the documents. "What kind of variances?" "Height limits, commercial use permits, very vague, but the paper trail shows those buildings were sold for 10 times their price within 2 years. It looks harmless, old paperwork, smart business. But he had practiced community organizing long enough to know what these patterns meant, especially when the timelines of political donations and city approvals matched so perfectly. And then came the Bronx connection. A closed lawsuit had been filed in 2005 in Bronx County under the name Riverwood Properties, LLC. At first glance, it looked like a routine insurance dispute after a building fire, but tucked in the appendix was a sealed affidavit alleging tenant intimidation, with signatures redacted. The judge, now retired, had sealed the file, citing ongoing investigations. No one looked deeper. No one wanted to. Ben looked up from his laptop. He's got too many LLCs attached to too many buildings with fires or sudden vacate orders right before a big sale. Either he's systematically pushing people out, or he's the unluckiest landlord in New York. That comment stuck with Zohran for days. He began building a timeline, 1985 to 2005. A series of small apartment buildings bought in gentrifying neighborhoods. A pattern of code violations followed by suspiciously timed fires. A consulting firm with 0 employees and 1 massive loan from a bank where Ross sat on the board. It wasn't just suspicious, it was structured. Zohran reached out to a contact in Albany, someone who used to work in the state attorney general's financial crimes unit. He agreed to talk under the condition that his name never appeared in anything official. "You want my opinion?" he said after skimming through the files Zohran sent over. It was a classic playbook, shells to move property through, nothing big enough to make headlines, but just enough to keep community boards quiet and investors happy. And the city agencies? Either they weren't looking, or someone told them not to. That's what burned the most. Not the alleged crimes themselves, but how quickly silence moved in when the names got powerful. Ross had spent years shaping his image, the civic-minded philanthropist, the job creator, the visionary. The world saw him as driven, but ultimately a force for the city's good. But Zohran saw it differently. The philanthropy wasn't generosity, it was protection. The more he dug, the more it became clear. Ross hadn't just benefited from the system, he had learned how to make the system disappear behind his public image. There was one moment Zohran kept coming back to, a fundraising gala for a museum in Manhattan, 2018. Zohran had been invited as a newly elected assembly member. Ross flew in for a brief appearance. He spoke for 12 minutes about giving back to the city that made him, didn't answer questions, and left through a back hallway with 2 of the most powerful lobbyists in Albany. Zohran remembered because it was the first time he noticed how guarded Ross was, even in a room full of admirers. "He's not untouchable," Zohran told Liam one late night in the office. "He just walks like no one's allowed to ask questions." Liam looked exhausted. "Yeah, but if you're gonna ask, make sure you have the kind of answers no one can spin." Zohran held up his growing stack of folders. "That's exactly what I'm building." And once he had enough, he stopped talking about it. He didn't tease it to the press. He didn't leak pieces to pundits. He waited. He watched. He picked his moment. And when that live roundtable came knocking, he knew this wasn't about scoring political points. It was about asking the question that too many people had ignored. Why has this man's past always been treated as off-limits? But what made it even more complicated was the case that never made it to court, the one that vanished just as it was heating up. The case file had no title on the cover, just a date, October 2nd, 2005. Location, Bronx County, New York. It was thin, about 15 pages long, but every sentence inside it carried weight. Zohran had gotten it through a retired paralegal named Rodney Klein who'd once worked for the Bronx District Attorney's Office. "The system misplaced this one," Rodney said, sliding the file across his kitchen table. "It wasn't supposed to vanish, but someone made it disappear." Inside was a memo referencing a suspected arson-for-profit scheme involving a rent-stabilized building owned by a shell company, Riverwood Properties, LLC. The key witness? A building superintendent named Hector Rivera, who had been quietly cooperating with the DA's office. He'd been living in the neighborhood his whole life, working under a city program for whistleblowers, but his cooperation had come at a price. He vanished, Rodney said, 2 weeks after this memo. Stopped showing him up to check-ins, never picked up his last paycheck. His apartment was cleared out overnight. Zohran flipped through the pages. Any chance he just left town? Rodney shook his head. His sister still lives 2 blocks away. Never heard from him again. Nothing. At the time, the case was labeled inactive. Eventually, it was closed under insufficient supporting testimony. In short, without Hector, the case died quietly. No headlines, no accountability. Zohran sat with that for a long time. He contacted an old friend at the New York Daily News, a local reporter named Chelsea Morano, who had covered the fire briefly when it first emerged. But back then, no one knew the full scope. I remember that, Chelsea told him over the phone. We tried to follow up, but the DA's office stonewalled us. Then one of our editors got a call from a lawyer downtown, and the story just vanished. Did you ever hear Stephen Ross's name in connection to it? Chelsea hesitated. Never on record, but there were whispers. We thought it was a reach. I mean, a billionaire developer mixed up in a single building fire in the Bronx, but now, I'm not so sure. Zohran stared out the window of his office, watching the rain slide down the glass. Everything about the case reeked of interference. Quiet, sophisticated interference. The deeper Zohran looked, the clearer the pattern became. LLCs were being moved around like chess pieces. One wrong question, and the game disappeared. He printed every page, every map, every note, and pinned it all on his office wall like a detective piecing together a cold case. Liam walked in one afternoon and just stared. You're not letting this go, are you? Zohran didn't even look up. Would you? He shook his head, then pulled up a chair. So what's the plan? We show people that power has fingerprints, even when it wears a bespoke suit and smiles for the cameras. There was one last thing in the file that Zohran couldn't ignore. A letter unsigned, typed and scanned. It read, "To whom it may concern, there are names you're not supposed to say and places you're not supposed to look. If you keep going, don't expect applause, expect silence, expect doors to close. But do it anyway. Some things are worth the price." Zohran had no idea who wrote it, but he read that line over and over again. Do it anyway. That letter was why he didn't hesitate when the round table invitation came. That letter was why he printed the documents, packed the folder, and told no one, not even his comms director, what he was about to do. Because when a system counts on silence, the loudest thing you can do is speak. But the round table didn't just catch Stephen Ross off guard. It sent shockwaves into a carefully managed world that wasn't built to be questioned. The producers at the NY1 studio in Manhattan had everything scheduled down to the second. A 7-minute opener on city budget strategy, a short debate on transit reform, and after that, a 10-minute panel on public-private accountability. That's where they slotted Zohran. What they didn't plan for, what no one planned for, was what he brought with him. The studio was neutral ground, no City Hall theatrics, no Albany pretense. The cameras were discreet, but the stakes were real. 5 guests, 4 mics, 1 host. The segment was meant to be polished, safe, and forgettable. The host, a man named Felix Roman, had been doing this for over 20 years. He was the kind of anchor who could glide through controversy like it was choreography. Until now. As Zohran laid out the evidence in front of him, the air in the room shifted. Felix looked at the camera, then back at Zohran, clearly unsure whether to cut to a break or lean in. The producers in the control room waved frantically through the glass. But he didn't move. Something about Zohran's tone held him. You're saying Stephen M. Ross was connected to a pattern of tenant displacement and financial misconduct during his company's largest expansion? Phase 3, he asked, trying to slow things down. I'm saying, Zohran replied, flipping to another page in his folder, that there were property deeds moved through a series of shell LLCs in New York and Delaware, entities that were dissolved after a single tax season. Ross's expression didn't change, but his hands gripped the arms of his chair on just a bit tighter. His PR assistant, sitting just off camera, shifted in her seat. Felix tried again. These are serious allegations. Have they been verified? Most of them have been ignored, Zohran said, his tone never rising. But they were never hidden. You just had to look. And someone finally did. That line, "You just had to look," was clipped and reposted online before the segment even ended. Ross finally spoke. "This is political theater. I'm not going to dignify these lies with a response." Zohran met his eyes for the first time. "If there are lies, you should welcome an investigation." Silence. Even the studio lighting felt hotter. Felix cleared his throat. "Okay, let's get back to..." But it was already too late. The control room's earpieces were erupting with calls from network affiliates, sponsors. Some wanted the feed cut, others begged them to keep rolling. They'd never had this kind of engagement in real time. Ross shifted strategy. "You're attacking me because you have no real policy. You're not talking about the economy or creating jobs. You're obsessed with tearing down success." Zohran's response was fast but firm. "If success comes at the cost of displacing families and manipulating the system, it deserves to be examined. I'm not here to tear anyone down. I'm here to speak up when too many people have been told to look the other way." The panelists sat frozen. One of them, a former prosecutor from the Manhattan DA's office, whispered to his neighbor off mic, "This is going to blow up. Big time." After the segment wrapped, Felix walked off stage, shaking his head. "We just aired the most important 7 minutes of the year," he muttered, "and none of it was in the script." Ross stormed out. No press availability, no handshake. His team moved quickly, his assistant on the phone with legal counsel before they even reached the elevator. A junior staffer tried to recover the folder from Zohran's desk during cleanup. Zohran had already taken it with him. Backstage, a few of the makeup artists clapped quietly as Zohran walked by. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. By the time he reached the curb outside, his phone was already vibrating nonstop. Messages, missed calls, his Twitter notifications were exploding. One text stood out. It was from a man Zohran hadn't spoken to in years, a retired investigator from the NYS Department of Financial Services. It said, "You said what most of us were too afraid to. I'm proud of you." But Zohran didn't have time to take it in. The backlash was coming, and it wouldn't be subtle. What started in a studio chair was about to ripple through the political machine like a cracked wire no one could fix. By the time Zohran made it back to his hotel room, his phone had hit 67 missed calls, 23 voicemails, and hundreds of text messages. He tossed it on the bed and stood by the window, watching the traffic move like nothing had happened. For the first time all day, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Down the hall, Liam was already fielding media requests. MSNBC, The Hill, a handful of podcasts. Everyone wanted a piece of what had just happened. But Zohran wasn't thinking about interviews. He was thinking about how fast the machine was about to push back. And it didn't take long. At 10:14 p.m., a carefully worded statement from Ross's legal team hit the wire. The Assemblymember's remarks were defamatory and entirely unfounded. "We are exploring all legal options to protect Mr. Ross's reputation from politically motivated slander." That line, "exploring all legal options," was the signal, the warning shot, the attempt to intimidate. Liam walked into the room and his laptop open. "They're calling it character assassination," he said, "and Fox News is already spinning it as an anti-capitalist attack from a radical socialist." Zohran didn't flinch. "Let them spin. The documents don't lie." "They don't have to," Liam muttered. "They just have to make people doubt." His inbox was also flooded, some of it supportive, messages from colleagues, strangers, even staffers from across the aisle. But it was the anonymous ones that stood out. One email read, "You think you're brave? Keep pushing and you'll disappear just like the last one." Another was just a video attachment, footage of him walking to his car the night before, taken from across the street. "You need to report this," Liam said when he saw it. "I know," Zohran replied, "but first, I want to know who sent it." A cybersecurity firm on retainer started digging immediately. They traced the IP to a proxy server, but there was no clear identity, no easy trail. But Zohran had dealt with this kind of shadow work before. What surprised him wasn't the threats. It was how fast the PR machine tried to rewrite the narrative. Within hours, right-wing commentators were flooding social media, claiming Zohran forged the documents. The playbook was clear. discredit him before anyone took a real look at what he said. But the thing was, some people already had. Around midnight, a journalist named Nina Sharma from the investigative outlet The City posted a thread breaking down Zohran's documents line by line. She included scans of court records, property timelines, and LLC registration dates. Within 3 hours, it had over 600,000 likes and nearly 100,000 retweets. Nina wasn't a pundit. She was a fact-checker, respected, quiet, deadly accurate. Her final tweet read, "If even half of what Assemblymember Mamdani presented is accurate, it deserves an investigation from the State Attorney General. This isn't drama, it's fraud." That was the moment the tone started shifting. Zohran sat up, reading every comment, every article. It didn't feel like vindication. It felt like the start of something he couldn't control anymore. Then came the email that froze him in place. Subject line, regarding the 2005 Bronx fire. No name, no sender. He clicked. Inside was a single sentence. "You missed the insurance payout. Check the beneficiary." And attached was a PDF. 3 insurance claim records he hadn't seen before. The beneficiary was another shell company he had flagged earlier in the week. Liam glanced over his shoulder. "Where did this come from?" "I don't know," Zohran said, "but it's legit." He didn't sleep that night. Too much movement, too many pieces falling at once. The next morning, he walked into his office in Albany to find a stack of messages waiting for her. One from the New York Legislative Ethics Commission, another from a Housing Oversight Committee, and then the kicker, a call from a moderate Democratic state senator's staffer requesting a private meeting. Liam raised an eyebrow. "That's new." "They smell blood in the water," Zohran said, "and they don't want to be caught pretending they didn't know." But what no one expected, what not even Zohran saw coming, was how quickly the people outside of politics would pick a side. It started with a video clip just 31 seconds long. Zohran Mamdani seated at the round table, calmly sliding a document across the desk as he says, "If they're lies, you should welcome an investigation." That clip was reposted by a political blog with less than 1,000 followers, then a digital rights group, then a retired journalist with a strong YouTube following. By noon the next day, it had over 11 million views. And then came the reaction videos. Teenagers on TikTok breaking down the exchange like it was a sports replay. Legal analysts doing frame-by-frame analysis. Even comedians stitching in commentary, calling it the most elegant takedown in New York political history. The momentum wasn't just online. Local radio stations in Buffalo and on Long Island opened their morning shows talking about it. Community groups and tenant unions passed the video through group chats. People were having conversations they hadn't dared have before. Zohran sat on the edge of his office desk, arms crossed, watching the numbers rise. Liam scrolled beside him, stunned. "We didn't push this. We didn't plant it. And yet, here we are." "People were ready for something real," Zohran said. "They're tired of everyone pretending like power can't be touched." Somewhere around the 15 million mark, celebrities started weighing in. An actress posted, "I've never seen someone hold their own like that." Mamdani didn't shout. He just showed up with the truth. An NBA player shared the video with 3 words, "We need more of this." Even more surprising were the DMs coming in from people Zohran would have never expected. Former staffers for political rivals, analysts from think tanks, even 2 former city officials who'd once proudly worked with Ross on development projects. One message stood out. It was from a woman named Elena Morales, who claimed to have worked as a paralegal at a law firm that structured Ross's early LLCs back in the 90s. Her message read, "Everything he's saying, it's real. I didn't understand it back then, but I saw how things were structured. We weren't allowed to keep records, and a specific fixer handled all the property closings. Cash retainers only." Zohran passed the message to his legal advisor. "If she agrees to speak, even off the record, we can cross-check what we've got." Meanwhile, Zohran's team set up a separate encrypted inbox for new tips. Within 48 hours, they had over 400 submissions. A retired bookkeeper from a construction firm, a former assistant at a Manhattan consultancy, even someone who once worked at the NYC Department of Buildings. Not everyone had proof, but the stories were consistent. Movements of money, missing invoices, projects that existed only on paper. By Friday, the public tide had clearly turned. It wasn't just a trending moment anymore. It was a citywide conversation. Cable news anchors were split. Some tried to downplay it as an overreach by a first-term assembly member. Others called for investigations, but it was the smaller local outlets that carried the real heat. Op-eds started pouring in with titles like, "Why did we ever stop asking questions about Stephen Ross?" And "It took a man like Zohran Mamdani to say what we were all thinking." Silence isn't class, it's strategy. It's strategy. Zohran didn't do any press. He didn't tweet a word. His silence only added to the storm. Meanwhile, Stephen Ross's team began to buckle. First, they canceled a scheduled keynote speech at a real estate development conference. Then, they pulled out of a high-profile groundbreaking ceremony in Hudson Yards. Behind the scenes, lawyers were reportedly scrambling to review past filings, old partnerships, and every document that could be tied to the resurfacing allegations. Still, Ross made no public appearance. No video, no interview, just a new statement posted quietly on his company's website. These attacks are baseless and rooted in a radical anti-business agenda. "I have always upheld the highest standards of integrity. This campaign to destroy my character will not succeed." It sounded rehearsed, cold, disconnected, the complete opposite of Zohran's direct, no-nonsense tone on live TV. And that contrast, that raw human clarity from Zohran, was what people connected with. One man in the Bronx wrote in an email to a local news blog, "I don't care about parties anymore." That man spoke like someone who had nothing to lose and everything to protect. That matters. Liam looked up from the growing pile of messages and said, "We started something." Zohran didn't smile. He just said, "Now we finish it." But the closer Zohran got to the truth, the more dangerous the silence around it became. By the second weekend after the broadcast, Zohran had gotten used to waking up to voicemails from blocked numbers. Some were just heavy breathing. Others played short, distorted clips of audio from his public speeches. He didn't flinch, but he didn't ignore them either. Security was tightened. The state police assigned 2 plainclothes officers to follow him at all public appearances. His apartment building in Queens added surveillance. Liam suggested he stay in a hotel for a while. Zohran refused. "I won't let anyone scare me out of my own life," he said. Still, the tension was building. Quiet pressure, strategic discomfort. He could feel it in meetings that used to be easy, see it in the way some of his colleagues in the assembly. He avoided eye contact in the halls of Albany. One staffer who had always been warm and chatty now gave him polite nods and kept walking. The message was clear. You're becoming a liability. That Monday morning, he received an unexpected visitor. Arthur Fines, a powerful, old-school Democratic assemblyman from a wealthy suburban district, appeared at his office without an appointment. Gray suit, briefcase, expression like granite. "We need to talk, Zohran," he said, closing the door behind him. Zohran gestured toward a seat but didn't sit himself. "What about?" "Optics. You're attracting the wrong kind of attention." "I'm attracting the truth." Fines paused, choosing his next words carefully. "There are quiet ways to handle things like this. You go too loud, and it becomes a circus. No one listens to substance once the shouting starts." Zohran folded his arms. "I didn't shout. I presented documents." Fines leaned forward. "You embarrassed a very powerful man on live television. One of this party's biggest donors. Whether you meant to or not, you created a moment that's now spiraling." "I didn't create the spiral. I opened the lid." He sighed. "You want my advice? Let it rest. Don't escalate. You've made your point." But Zohran had heard that tone before. The voice of men who preferred silence over confrontation, calm over truth. He knew how this game worked. Pressure in private, platitudes in public. After he left, Liam walked in with another message. This one from a well-connected real estate lobbyist offering to support Zohran's re-election fund in exchange for a statement softening his position. Zohran didn't respond. Later that day, a former journalist named Sophia Reyes reached out. She'd worked on a piece about real estate money in city politics back in 2010, but was pushed out by her editor before it was published. She'd seen Ross's name back then too. "I still have my notes," Sophia said over the phone. The names, the transactions, even a photo of one of the shell company agents. I didn't forget, I just didn't think anyone else would care. Zohran arranged for her to send everything securely. The story was bigger than he thought. It wasn't just about Ross's records anymore. It was about an entire web, foundations, corporations, silent partners, some of whom had helped shape city policy. Even his own supporters grew nervous. A Democratic donor group emailed his campaign manager expressing deep concern. One line stuck out: "We support courage, but not recklessness." Liam slammed the laptop shut. "They want clean heroes, not messy truth-tellers." "Then they picked the wrong man," Zohran replied. The final straw that week came late Thursday night. A courier delivered an unmarked envelope to his office. Inside, a printed still image from a security camera showing him walking through LaGuardia Airport with a red circle around his head. No message, no sender. Just a picture that said, "We see you." He showed it to Liam, who sat in stunned silence. "You okay?" he asked finally. "I'm angry," he said. "Not scared, just angry." He took the image and taped it to his office wall above the growing mess of documents and evidence. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of who he was dealing with. Because fear is their currency, and Zohran refused to buy in. But the pressure wasn't slowing him down. It was preparing him for what came next. The part where truth stepped into the spotlight and the world had to watch. The hearing room in Albany wasn't built for drama. Pale beige walls, stiff-backed chairs, microphones that never quite worked right. But when Zohran Mamdani walked through the double doors that morning, you could feel the weight shift. It had been 19 days since the roundtable went viral. Now, under mounting public pressure, the New York State Assembly's Committee on Housing had scheduled a formal review. What had started as a 7-minute interruption on a live show was now a state matter. Cameras lined the walls. Reporters scribbled fast. Viewers tuned in from airports, offices, living rooms. They weren't just curious anymore. They wanted answers. The room was full but quiet. Zohran wore a plain dark suit. No statement, no bright colors, just focus. Assemblyman Marcus Thorne, who chaired the committee, opened with a neutral tone. "Today's session is not a trial. It is a step toward clarity," he said, turning towards Zohran. "Assemblymember Mamdani, the floor is yours." Zohran didn't thank him, didn't posture. He adjusted the mic and began. "Everything I presented was based on documentation obtained through legal and public channels, property deeds, city filings, recorded transactions. This isn't about politics, it's about patterns. Patterns that suggest a misuse of trust, of power, and of silence." He paused, then added, "If these patterns were tied to anyone else, anyone without that last name, this room would have been full years ago." Gasps were subtle but present. Thorne looked uncomfortable. A junior assembly member from a suburban district cleared her throat. "Are you saying Mr. Ross is guilty of a crime?" "I'm saying he was involved in a structure that deserves investigation," Zohran replied, "and that until now, no one had the stomach to ask the hard questions." At that moment, a document was projected behind him. A deed transfer record for a Bronx property passed between 3 different Ross-controlled LLCs in a single day. Zohran walked the committee through the details. The dates, the negligible sale prices, and the corporate records connecting all 3 LLCs back to Ross's main company. The room didn't breathe. Stephen M. Ross was not in attendance. His legal team submitted a statement. "Mr. Ross has nothing to hide. He will not dignify political bullying with his presence." But the cameras were already panning to the empty chair at the witness table. The symbolism spoke for itself. Halfway through the session, something unexpected happened. A retired inspector from the NYC Department of Buildings, unlisted on the witness roster, stood up in the gallery and quietly handed an envelope to the sergeant-at-arms. Inside were copies of original inspection reports from the Bronx building that had burned down, reports that were later replaced in the official file. The originals noted clear fire code violations. The replacements showed none. The committee froze. Zohran looked at the documents as they were passed to him. He said nothing for a few seconds. Then, "This is what happens when you crack the door open. People finally come forward." By late afternoon, the story was everywhere again, but with more weight this time. It wasn't just social media buzz, it was real questions from real people, backed by real documents. Even news networks that had initially dismissed the roundtable were broadcasting highlights from the hearing on loop. Liam watched from the side, arms crossed. This wasn't what they expected when they first stepped into that diner in Astoria 3 weeks earlier. "I thought we were going to shake a tree," he whispered to a staffer. "We started an avalanche." Outside, protesters had gathered. Some held signs in support of Zohran. Others shouted that he was a liar. The usual chaos. But he didn't hear it. He stayed inside, watching the room change around him. As the hearing closed, Assemblyman Thorne cleared his throat again. "We will reconvene next week after reviewing the additional materials submitted today. Let the record show that this is far from over." Zohran nodded, stood, and left the room without a word. Cameras followed. He said nothing. But people were speaking for him now, strangers, experts, survivors of tenant harassment who recognized the signs in what he'd revealed. Voices that had once been buried were now echoing across the state. His story had turned into a spark. Now the state was watching the fire. But the point of the fire was never destruction. It was to burn away what was hiding underneath. 2 weeks after the hearing, Zohran found himself alone on the small balcony outside his district office in Astoria. The sun was low, his inbox was still full, investigators were still asking for more. But for the first time in over a month, the noise around him felt manageable, focused. Liam joined him with a fresh stack of messages. 2 more subpoenas sent out this morning, and the committee is reviewing those inspection files next week. Zohran nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He looked out toward the skyline and said, "You know what I keep thinking about? The people who wanted me to leave it alone, who told me I was overreaching, that I'd ruin my career if I opened my mouth." "You didn't ruin anything," Liam said. "You reminded people why truth still matters." But Zohran knew it was more complicated than that. His staff had received threats, his parents had been harassed online, and real estate lobbyists had pulled out of meetings. And yet, he had no regrets. This had never been about taking down Stephen M. Ross. It had always been about breaking the illusion that if someone was rich enough, powerful enough, or philanthropic enough, they didn't have to answer for their past. That illusion was gone now. Whether or not charges were ever filed, whether or not the assembly hearings continued, something had shifted. People had seen what it looked like when someone stood up and didn't back down. And more importantly, they saw what it took to do it. In the weeks following the hearing, more whistleblowers came forward. A former lawyer from a top real estate firm who handled LLC formations. A city planner who was pressured to approve zoning changes in the 90s. Even a construction union leader who had been silenced years ago after raising safety concerns on one of Ross's early projects. None of them had spoken before. Now they were sending files, statements, willing to testify. One woman, a retired housing advocate from the Bronx, left a voicemail Zohran would never forget. "I stayed quiet for years because I didn't think anyone would listen. But you made them listen. You didn't scream. You didn't run. You just showed up with the truth. Thank you." That message stuck with Zohran more than any headline or trending hashtag. He knew people still doubted him. They always would. He'd heard the rumors that he was doing it for attention, that he was just an anti-capitalist trying to score points, that he was trying to build a brand. All the old label meant to shrink someone who refused to sit down. But none of it mattered now. What mattered was the ripple he started. In college classrooms, students were studying the hearing as part of civic literacy units. Tenant unions were using his case as a template to push for transparency legislation. Other lawmakers, quietly at first, had begun asking deeper questions about real estate, LLCs, tax abatements, and the influence of developer money in politics. Zohran wasn't trying to become a movement. He just wanted to tell the truth and not be punished for it. And in doing that, he reminded people of something they had almost forgotten. Silence may protect the powerful, but courage exposes what power tries to hide. Liam returned to the office and handed him a letter. No name, just a return address in Buffalo, New York. It read, "I used to believe the system couldn't be challenged, that people like me didn't matter. But watching you stand up with facts in your hand and fire in your voice made me believe again. Thank you for making me feel seen. Zohran folded the letter and slipped it into his desk drawer. He didn't know who wrote it, but he knew exactly why it was sent. Not every battle ends in court. Some end in change. And sometimes the biggest victory is simply refusing to be quiet. He turned to Liam and said, "This isn't over." "No," he said, "but now they know who's watching." And that was the difference. So when people ask about the day Zohran Mamdani challenged Stephen M. Ross on live television, the documents he laid out, and the firestorm that followed, it's not just a story about scandal or headlines. It's a story about what happens when one person, with nothing to gain and everything to risk, chooses to tell the truth anyway. If this story moved you, if it made you think twice about silence, speak up, share this, talk about it. Because the moment we stop asking questions is the moment we give our power away. And if you believe the truth still matters, subscribe. More stories are coming.